And that's the tricky part about all that shit. Motivation is just a word. You have to have these different things in your mind on where you want to go and know that motivation is not going to get me there.
What things in your mind? Is motivation inherently just a short burst? Is David Goggins implying that you can act without a reason? Or is the reason just being left unnamed and chalked up to discipline?
Because I'm not going to always be motivated.
Jocko said the exact same thing. He said that discipline eats motivation for breakfast.
And discipline's good too.
If that is the case and discipline eats motivation, as Jocko says, then what is it? What exactly is the word discipline referring to? A biological mechanism? A mystical willpower? Clearly we can see that the topic of motivation and discipline is very vague and quite intricate. So in this video, I aim to give in my opinion, better view of all of this in a way which is productive and internally coherent, as well as hopefully more scientifically credible than its conventional counterpart. Therefore, do keep in mind that it is just my view of things, as is the case for most of my videos, so I'm not trying to declare it like some formal thesis of truth. There are a couple reasons why I think this subject is important, and why it feels appropriate to post it right now. In regards to the latter, this video is being uploaded early in the year, more precisely in late January, where I'm sure a lot of people tend to give up or at least loosen up on their New Year resolutions. So I thought it fit in to discuss this adjacent topic, as it might actually help someone either get back on the resolution bandwagon or keep on keeping on if they've never left it. But generally, I think this topic is important because the way you see things, such as motivation and discipline, might be the reason you stick to a regimen or the reason you leave it. Naturally, I believe it to not only be a prominent topic, but a fairly interesting one as well. I'd also encourage you to watch until the end given the sophistication and complex nature of this discussion, because that's where I try to put all of this into a fully fledged understanding. With all of that out of the way, let's start with the basics and work our way up. Or down, I guess. Chapter 1. Traditional Understandings. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary definition of motivation underscores it as a force, stimulus or influence, likening it to an incentive or drive. We can see that this definition, as is conventional, highlights motivation as a specific source pushing you to do something. It's not said to be stable, good, bad, or otherwise, but just something which keeps you moving forward. That is indeed how we typically see motivation, something perhaps volatile but powerful, and its morally ambiguous nature is highlighted in expressions such as, the criminal's motivation was revenge, where we see that the word is not reserved to good sources of motivation only. On the other hand, the definition of discipline is likened to self-control, an activity that one engages in regularly to train or improve oneself. The key word there being regularly. We seem to find that discipline is similar to motivation in the sense that it pushes one to move forward, but it's more stable, more regulated, and thereby more reliable. It's also perhaps seen as more positive. Of course, none of us are surprised by these definitions. This is the usual talk of needing to rely on discipline instead of motivation because it's what keeps you going when you don't want to keep going. Meaning that motivation is almost presupposed to be fading, something which won't last, whereas discipline will. Or rather, that discipline can't even fade, that it's definitionally everlasting. But is there any actual credence to this standpoint? We'll have to look a bit further. Chapter 2. Dig in deeper. The definition or outlook behind discipline makes superficial sense, but it seems to beg the question, how does it exist? If the default circumstance is being motivated to accomplish a given task, in what way or during what process does discipline seep into existence? And if it does, is it based on the initial motivation or independent from it? In other words, we should find out how one can acquire discipline. Maybe looking at a few examples can shed some light on this.
Like, their strength comes through what they know I'm doing. So there's so many times I want to get up and say, oh man, fuck it, man, I got mine, I'm good. And I'm like, fucking Tommy out there, motherfucker. Fucking Tommy talking about.
Tommy in his email.
Tommy talking about fucking,
he saved his life.
Man, I ran 10 miles last night because of you, man. I'm like, you know, a lot of people can live off of that and they can fucking be good with that.
You know, not too much.
Well, oftentimes people just need momentum. They need one good day.
Right.
You need one
That's
good
it.
day.
That's why I said to that one guy, just come to the gym one day.
Yeah. If you have
Once.
one good day where you eat clean, you drink a lot of water, and you like you did. You got that day, you woke up, you put your shoes on, you went for a run, you worked out your driveway, you got a good day in.
Yep.
That's sometimes all you need to do and decide, this is what I do from now on. I have good days.
Yeah.
Tomorrow's going to be another good day, and then I'm going to force myself into another good day. And the next thing you know, I've got some momentum.
Right.
You got some momentum, you could change everything.
Yep.
The videos we just saw only seem to stir a little more confusion. We have David Goggins mentioning that he also faces what's traditionally seen as demotivation, which supposedly shouldn't be the case if you're disciplined, but he keeps going because of what his encouraging image represents for someone. In the second clip, we have Joe Rogan bringing a new interesting word into the conversation, momentum, which seems tied to habit making and not intrinsically linked to motivation or discipline. These clips didn't exactly help us get much closer to our answer, but they did highlight something important, which is that discipline is not an independent concept. It must be tied to something. For Goggins, at least in the context of the clip, this something is Tommy, and for Joe Rogan, this something is momentum. So, what does that really mean? Chapter 3. My personal view. I believe that discipline isn't fundamentally separate from motivation. Rather, I think it's best understood as the consequence of stable motivation. When we are motivated, the source is key. Usually, people are motivated because it's the start of the year, because their partner left them, because they were doubted, etc. What these sources have in common is that they're naturally short-lasting. They're volatile. They hit you like a freight train and give you a sharp spike of motivation. But because people tend to move on, the hype dies down, necessarily so, doubt comes and goes and so on, they stop getting the job done. But nothing says motivation must be limited to these volatile happenings and events. We can rightfully expand it to include other sources like personal necessity, long-term goals, and principles. And it's thereby easy to see how the motivation brimming from these sources is going to be much more dependable. And this seems to suggest that being disciplined relies on the motivational source being better, meaning more stable and reliable, thereby marking discipline as less of some independent powerhouse and more of a result of solid motivation. Let us now more deeply explore what kinds of sources might initiate a discipline. Chapter 4. The Forms of Discipline. Circling back to the aforementioned clips, we can distinguish two distinct forms of motivation which lead to discipline. There might be more, and feel free to point them out in the comments below, but these two are the ones which jump out at me. The first one is David Goggins' Tommy. I believe that we can liken this to an abstract source of motivation. Goggins isn't motivated because of Tommy specifically, he's motivated because of what he represents to those in need of motivation all over the world.
I'm a guy who wants to make people better. For people to get better, I have to continuously get better myself. For me to do that, I can't just say, oh, I have this resume, the resume is there forever, I'm good.
Realistically, this source isn't disappearing anytime soon, nor is it tied to something very tangibly representable like a specific group of people or outcomes. This effectively launches it into the abstract and thus makes the source of motivation nearly indestructible, or at least relatively hard to break. It's like when a person is principled. They don't necessarily have a quantifiable reason for sticking to their principle. In fact, arguably the point of the principle is being self-sufficient. Although Goggins may not agree with me, at least not semantically, you can see a lot of what I'm saying manifested in some of his words.
It's this magical thing, purpose that we're all looking for. But what's funny about it all is that we need these things to perform. But we don't take a second to realize the purpose is always there. The purpose never leaves us because the very purpose is you. You are always the purpose. There may be another purpose, like being a SEAL or going to college or whatever, but the main purpose in life is you. So that's the only purpose I fucking need. So the reason I get up every day, even though there's no race or there's no school, or there's nothing in front of me, is because I have pride in myself.
And what is such a rooted purpose if not a stable, constant source of motivation? One so robust it never even allows you to fail. Another interesting source highlighted by Joe is building momentum and thus potentially building habits. The marathon runner who goes on a daily 3-mile jog, for instance. Why is he doing it? Sure, it might be that he's preparing for an event or that he wants to upkeep his health. But it's also possible that, mostly, he's simply used to it. It's the routine. It's what he does. Perhaps he had a good, strong reason initially, but if you cherry-picked his 345th time doing it, for example, is it indeed the reason fueling that specific run, or just his habit taken over, at least momentarily? This dilutes discipline even more from this foggy and powerful force to the aftermath of a biological mechanism. Hey, you watching this, I bet you're quite disciplined in fidgeting with your finger when reading or brushing your teeth. Is that completely because you're conscious of the act and its underlying meaningful reason, or is it more likely that a large part of it is habit? You might actually find it a bit odd to say you're disciplined in performing such effortless activities, but seemingly you are. To briefly recap, discipline, in my opinion, is not a separate internal trait, but a stable motivational structure, sustained either by some abstraction, like identity or principle, or occasionally by automation, habit. Yet, there is another pivotal element to the equation which we haven't discussed so far, and it's what will help us cross the T's and dot the I's. Chapter 5. Willpower and finishing the framework. We defined a discipline as being the culmination of harnessing a motivational source which is inherently more stable and thus reliable, and thereby the acts it births are more regular and constant. However, we might be overly expanding the definition of the word motivation while limiting the meaning of the word discipline, and thus leaving out the word needed to describe that important moment in which a person makes an active decision to ignore a bad decision, which is itself a competing motivation. Conventionally, this is framed as the person's ability to pick between one source and another. Verily, we might have competing inner voices, one of which leans towards comfort while the other tries to push us toward more difficult but potentially better choices. So, by what tool do we pick which source takes precedence? This is where I believe willpower comes into play. But similar to how we dealt with discipline, we're not going to resort to the conventional outlook of loosely defining willpower as this mystical source of energy, but as an instrument. In other terms, it's the very mechanism, the steering wheel, if you will, by which you adjust the state between your different sources of motivation. This makes it more granular and limited. And this is where we ask a crucial million-dollar question. Is it the willpower being strong or weak which decides what source ends up winning? Is it an active tool? Conventionally, we might answer yes. However, under my view and according to what we have been arguing so far, it is not a game of willpower or magical discipline. It's a matter of source. To say willpower is at the end of the causal chain doesn't solve our problem. It further obfuscates it. It doesn't particularly help us in drawing a productive conclusion. Therefore, in my opinion, metaphorically, the coherent perspective is that sources function as entities with a sort of gravitational pull, which is naturally decided by how they play into your life. For example, the motivation behind becoming a scientist will be stronger for the aspiring chemist than for a carpenter. And it is this pull which heavily affects in which way your steering wheel, willpower, moves. If you legitimately do not have a good why for pursuing goal XYZ, it's not too surprising that your willpower leans towards motivations antithetical to that goal or ones simply not aligned with it, meaning we're certain that the willpower itself does not truly have any inherent power, or at least not much. This is akin to the classic quote, if you don't do it, then you don't want it bad enough. And according to what we've been pointing out, there is a lot of merit to this judgment. That said, I don't think it's entirely true, but it does serve to frame my perspective under more layman terms. To reiterate, fundamentally, all you are working with is different sources of motivation, all pursuant of different goals and achievements, and how strong this source is relative to your actual practical priorities will primarily affect if you end up choosing it.
So, at some point, you have to decide if you're serious about things. And if you're not, then you're not doing anything of sufficient worth. That's the rule. And if you are doing something of sufficient worth, then you let go of the things that interfere with it.
Where it was like, you can talk about what you care about, you can talk about your values, but what you really legitimately are passionate about and resonate with is what you actually do. Somebody can sit here and say they love doing cardio, but if they never do it, well, then they're just full of you know what, right? So,
for example, this might lead us from saying the person who's unhealthily overweight is undisciplined when it comes to sticking to a diet, a statement which, although observationally true, lacks explanatory power, but rather that they are simply not sufficiently motivated to behave differently. From a different view, we might say they're quite disciplined in not sticking to a diet. The expression sounds a bit odd or funny, but according to our framework, it's completely sensible. To analogize, we don't prescribe a sick patient health or being healthy, which is effectively what you'd be doing if you said just be disciplined. Instead, we prescribe them a medicine, the motivation, which once taken will lead to a stable state of health. Thus, you can organically comprehend how if this medicine isn't strong enough or didn't prove efficacious in the eyes of the patient, maybe relative to other drugs as well, other sources of motivation, they might stop taking it. Thereby you might feel inclined to say they're undisciplined, as in not healthy, but now you see how that sounds a bit silly. Anyway, that is admittedly quite a lot and a bit controversial. Before providing a productive conclusion, let us confront some counterpoints. Chapter 6. Potential Objections. This kind of chapter will probably become a recurrent theme in these types of videos. As I hinted at, I will predict some possible objections and try to answer them ahead of time. 1.
I do what must be done even when the competing motivations are strong, like enhancing my short-term mood. That's discipline, not motivation.
Indeed, that is how people usually contextualize discipline. However, this merely pushes the can down the road, as I simply ask, why? Why stick to your task despite emotional turbulence? Are you saying you're disciplined because you're disciplined? This doesn't invalidate the existence of motivation. In fact, it confirms it, as in there exists a deeper, more stable, more powerful motivation which is prioritized over emotions in your overall mood. It might feel like you're not actually motivated and instead acting thanks to something else against other motivations, but I think there exists a more rooted, perhaps silently powerful, motivational source which drives you forward, and that's what causes your discipline. And given that it's more slow and steady rather than quick and thrilling, it's more difficult to straightforwardly pinpoint. 2.
Sticking to something for a long time is discipline. This isn't anything new.
I agree. I don't mean to frame this video as particularly revolutionary or groundbreaking. This is primarily a case of cleaning up semantics and suggesting a hierarchical clarity to offer a, in my opinion, more truthful, more coherent, and hopefully more productive outlook on motivation and discipline. 3.
Some people do things out of moral duty. There isn't always a self-benefiting reason.
This is probably a topic for another day as it touches on ambiguous concepts like altruism, but to keep it simple, this is true, but it isn't an argument against what I've been discussing. Not all sources of motivation must be explicitly selfish some way or another. Some might be seemingly entirely fueled by benefiting others at some of your detriment, like a Goggins running for Tommy's sake. 4.
Are you better if you're disciplined than someone who's not?
Now this is a dicey question. I think this expands into a much larger topic which I'll reserve for another video, but for now, I'll stick with a half-baked no. I do not think discipline, as in the consequence of more stable motivation, is inherently indicative of someone who's more worthy of praise. It is simply a descriptor, not a judgment. This does seem to chip away at the notion of superiority because you stuck to a task long term, but if we are to primarily see discipline as the result of finding a decent source of motivation, then we cannot hope to intrinsically attach an element of elitism to that. There are certainly ways in which you might extract a vague sense of superiority or goodness, for instance, in the conscious effort to identify a stable source of motivation, but even that remains unclear and foggy at best. That said, stay on the lookout for a future video discussing this more in depth. That's about it for the main objections I foresee. Feel free to make other ones in the comments below. Chapter 7. Conclusion. Expectedly, this pushes us to question the relevancy behind this assessment. Specifically, what productive value is there to be derived? In my opinion, this gets rid of all of the unrealistic expectations and comparisons in regard to people being disciplined. You might see someone like David Goggins go for his daily run more or less no matter the circumstances, and think that he must have reached the new pinnacle of hard work and consistency that you're either unable to match or very far from achieving. Moreover, the fact that discipline is regarded as a transition from motivation or fundamentally alternative fuel frames it in a tricky way which practically forces you to put up some arbitrary barrier between saying you're motivated and saying you're disciplined. You even have an influx of videos pinning these two words against one another and claiming discipline is superior, as I highlighted earlier. And these sorts of outlooks can obviously affect whether or not you stick to your goals and plans. To avoid misunderstandings and reiterate, it's not that discipline doesn't exist or describe real behavior, it's that it doesn't explain it. So perhaps forget the magical black box view you might have grown accustomed to and the classic phrase, "you're not disciplined." Instead of waiting for discipline to be unlocked or trying to perform some mental gymnastics to figure out if you've crossed that imaginary barrier, find yourself a strong why. Find yourself a reason so compelling that it's actually fairly difficult to ignore it, and do not expect it to present itself so readily. After all, if discipline is hard, then so must be finding the why to get there. It might be hard to hear, but whatever source of motivation is behind your binge eating or erratic drinking might be simply stronger than that guiding your more rational choices. Do not haphazardly wait for Captain Discipline to save the day somehow. Instead, want your goal bad enough by justifying it robustly. Don't rely on lackluster motivation like the passing of a calendar year. Locate a bedrock, not a soft cushion for you to stand on. You might get lucky and just grow into a good habit, but it probably isn't practically wise to hold your breath waiting for that to happen. A close friend of mine helped me develop a good analogy to recap, and it's that of being a driver inside a vehicle. Let's suppose you want to head to a good destination, your goal, but it's far and the road is cumbersome. Being weakly motivated to reach this destination is akin to trying to fill up your gas tank with oil. You find yourself running short midway through and might take the nearest exit to bad destinations, even if you were advancing quite rapidly in the beginning, that is, you were motivated. But now picture modifying your vehicle so that it runs on mere hydrogen. From an outside perspective, you might think the driver heading to their good destination non-stop with no detours as being disciplined, and you'd be right, but not necessarily because they possess this discipline or have control over some special willpower, mystical steering wheel, but because they care so deeply about their destination that they found and implemented a sufficient fuel source. We don't need to be better drivers. We need to be better engineers. We need to stop fighting the steering wheel or inherent qualities of self and start looking at what's in the tank. And if you don't find that what's in the tank is sufficient, be brutally honest. Is your destination worth finding a new fuel for? Should it even be a question if the destination is that important to you?
There's a lot going into that. But I think one of the best ways, or some of the best traits that people have where they can stick to this kind of stuff really consistently, is there is no debate. There is no inner monologue of, oh, do I do it? I don't know. Maybe I should just go home. I should skip it. I should just, like, there is no bubbling up of these thoughts of excuses. They're just doing it. There's no question that this guy is going to go get a pump. So
there are evidently limits to this analogy, and no matter which way you painted this whole topic, there are edge cases, potential exceptions, or strenuous circumstances that might render any outlook as incomplete. But I do believe that this is how it is by default. To summarize concisely yet effectively, at the deepest level, motivation, discipline, and whatever is in between collapse into one thing: your reason for doing. Polish that, and the rest takes care of itself. There's also a quote that I saw somewhere and modified which I think poetically captures this idea. You do not defeat darkness by waiting for sunrise. You do so by finding a fire. And if you don't find fire or it goes out, then light your own. And with that, stay true and healthy.